Okay, let's begin with a short meditation. Okay. Primary theme that we began to explore last week um, is the notion of the Earth entering into a process that could lead to some type of a global transition, a global awakening. Of course, this is a common theme that we hear about a lot these days, though the perspectives or understandings that people share vary about what that's all about quite a bit sometimes. The timing varies, of course, and the exact nature of the change that's happening in the world, even the degree of certainty or not, whether something will happen, what kind of outcome we'll see. I wanted to begin by sharing for a moment a little bit about my own experience, and not so much the details of the experience, because I'll be sharing some of those as we continue throughout this webinar, but more at the moment, a little bit about where my own understanding comes from. And this is actually a general statement too, because it pertains to everything that I'm sharing in these contexts and in my writings and so on. Essentially, my own perspective on things like spiritual practice or philosophy, or in this context, the nature of the world situation, and a sort of vision of what the higher vision is behind this working with the earth by various orders of beings and so on. My own understanding of these things is okay, let me is based on most of fundamentally is based on intuition. I certainly talk to people, I read, so there's even in a sense sometimes have conversations with non-physical intelligences of different sorts. All of this is part of the input that contributes to my understanding, but the bottom line for me is that I rely most fundamentally on intuition. And to speak to that for a moment, for me, one of the basic elements of intuition, what I mean when I use that word, because the word, of course, as I've spoken a little bit about in the past, is used in a wide variety of ways. And so since I use the word a lot myself, it's important to me to clarify exactly what I mean. Sometimes people use the word intuition essentially synonymous with like a hunch. It's kind of more of an instinctual feeling type of thing. Other times people use the word intuitive very frequently, I would say, use the term intuition to refer to psychic experiences. When we say I'm going to an intuitive, it generally means going to somebody who is considered to be psychic. Will do some kind of a psychic reading for us. I'm actually using the word in another way that's also common, which is to mean a profound alternative, you might say, form of uh, understanding. Although, in a broader sense, I actually use the word intuition to include a way of being as well, not just a receptive mode of understanding, but also a whole state of consciousness. One of the things about intuition that I'll talk about more in the future is my experience of intuition is that it's a product of a marriage between feeling and knowing, of body and mind, of sensation and understanding. There's a way in which these two realities, like even looking at modern science as an interesting example. Science is based very much on the idea of a kind of dialogue between mind and body, where on the bodily level, science uses the senses and extensions of the senses, like a microscope, to gather information about the physical world. And then that information is transferred to the mind, where the mind cultivates theories and models about that sensory data that's being collected. And then we go back to the body again to test those theories to see if we can find ways to see if those are good models. And then in this way, there's a sort of ongoing dialogue between the body and mind. A marriage is sort of being developed between the two to give understanding, to give scientific knowledge. So in a sense, you could say that science is a marriage of, it's not purely abstract, philosophical, or mathematical way of trying to comprehend things, nor is it a purely sensory mode. In fact, I would argue there's really no such thing as a pure, absolutely pure version of either. There's a way in which they're interdependent. And an intuition is actually a deeper experiential product of the marriage of mind and body, as the essence, the deeper essence of the truth of what's the soul, you might say, of the physical and bodily dimensions, and the soul of the mind dimensions, the essence of knowing, is revealed. It's discovered that they're profoundly interdependent and inseparable from each other. This is one of the reasons why in intuitive knowledge, deep intuitive knowledge, there's a strong feeling component, because feeling is the essence of body nature and sensation, not only on the physical level, but even on the subtler levels, the psychic levels and the astral mental levels. These are still form dimensions that are perceived through subtle senses. And the essence of that, we could just call feeling in general. So if you wed feeling and mind, so that instead of like science, you're kind of trying to weave a relationship between the two, going back and forth and creating an understanding that's based on kind of this ping-ponging back and forth. Intuition is actually the state in which these two realities are fused into one state of consciousness. They're not separate anymore. It's a fusion of knowing and feeling into an integral state, a holistic state of understanding that's subsequently capable of understanding anything pertaining to any plane of reality, physical and non-physical. So the reason I kind of go into this a little bit, my sense of intuition, is because it helps to understand a little bit better my own process and people like myself who are not only on a spiritual path, but also are involved in different ways in understanding and responding to things like, for instance, our world situation right now. And in that context, my own approach has very much to do with entering into a deep union of feeling and knowing that I call intuition. And so on a practical level, part of the way that works is that the more profoundly I open to a strong feeling connection to the world. Intuitive knowledge or realization and expression are born out of that. And the more I open, the more I understand. We open in this very accepting, conscious, spacious way. Knowing and feeling fuse, and the deeper we know, the more understanding comes. And this, to me, is sort of both a combination, therefore, of a way of serving, a way of awakening. It deepens my own spiritual growth. It also enhances my understanding of the world around me. And it's actually a form of participating in the world and sharing in world evolution all at the same time. So although, for instance, at times I'll say read an interesting book and find something interesting about what the author's talking about pertaining to whatever, let's say, what's happening in the world, or I'll even perhaps have a conversation with an inner colleague in other dimensions and have a kind of what might be best described as at times it could be as simple as just sort of an exchange of information, So I make a distinction between gaining information in a mode of like conversation, whether it's physical or non-physical, versus intuitive understanding. So the bottom line for me is that I base my own core understanding not on things I've read or things that that's been shared with me even by beings that are, I experience to be more enlightened than myself. I value what they have to say, but in the end, if it isn't part of my own intuitive understanding, then I don't tend to focus on that in what I share. It needs to be something that's transformed into something that I intuitively resonate with. And it's become part of my view, my spiritual, personal spiritual understanding. And there's a way in which that is really an ongoing process, because the marriage of the essence of mind and body in each of us is at the heart of what I would describe as spiritual development. That's a specific way of talking about what spiritual development is. It's a marriage of these fundamental inner dimensions of ourselves that gives rise to a state of consciousness, wisdom, and a wholeness, and the development of our love that is our awakening. It is our spiritual evolution, and it is our deepening contribution to the world around us, being in that state, unfolding that state more and more. So for me, there's always a cutting edge to that. There's a deepening or an expansion into dimensions of feeling and knowing, intuitive understanding that is, a kind of is beyond what I've experienced before, is a fresh territory. Often there's challenge to that, because part of that includes it's not a feeling upward exclusively into sort of it's a holistic expansion into all dimensions, including the pain in the world. And so in a sort of tantric sense, you could say intuition transforms all dimensions of experience, including being with suffering, into a deepened understanding and deepened intuitive realization of that. So everything that can be understood in a spiritual context, things like what is the nature of a spiritual quality, like contentment or love or wisdom or purpose? What is my dharma? What is happening in the world around us? What is the nature of the human kingdom? What is the nature of other forms of life around us in the physical world and in subtler dimensions? What are these chakras that we talk about, or different dimensions, planes that all of these things can be directly comprehended through intuition. It helps to be introduced to ideas about these things for various reasons, but on a spiritual path, the function of that is ultimately to stimulate our intuitive development to the point where we have a direct, experiential, intuitive realization of the nature of these realities. So when it comes to this core concept that this course, for instance, is based on, the notion of the crisis, the challenge, and the potential for awakening that's happening in the world today, my own experience of the nature of that is very fundamentally based more on an intuitive approach to opening to different realities. So for instance, when I meditate, it's not uncommon for spontaneous themes to emerge where I'll be sitting, kind of minding my own business, if you will, just feeling deeply, opening, being in a state of presence and spaciousness and compassion and equanimity, and different feelings and process are kind of unfolding within me, and then suddenly I'll understand something more deeply. I might even feel a sensation of a kind of bottleneck experience where there's a buildup of a shift, a tension, and then suddenly a clarity will come, or something will be born out of that, and I'll simply suddenly understand something more clearly. I'll see a relationship between, two things that I had no idea were connected in some way. And it's not primarily an intellectual process. It's like I said, it's a deep feeling knowing, the fusion of, it's a holistic understanding. And then that just keeps unfolding more. And in a sense, all of us are doing that to some extent when we engage, especially like say if we're meditating, even though we might not think of it in the terms that I just described. Like, for instance, if even the act of working to cultivate a basic quality like concentration is an intuitive process, because we're deepening through both experience and understanding a stronger feeling, experience, knowingness-based direct appreciation for what does concentration mean. By learning to concentrate, we're realizing what concentration is. And that's actually at its deepest level, that's an intuition that we're cultivating. Ultimately, to be deeply concentrated is a very intuitive experience. To be very, very accepting is a very intuitive experience. The more we develop these qualities, to be loving, to be wise, these are all intuitive experiences at a more soulful level. And we don't need to rise up into some kind of a non-earthly direction, so to speak, in order to experience these things. They can be born very immediately out of the material of our day-to-day experience. So that's where my understanding of what's going on primarily comes from. I do and will reference other people too, because it's a way of kind of bouncing off. There's various people like Sri Aurobindo, for instance, that have spoken extensively about the world situation. Modern figures, David Spangler, going back a century or more, there's the Theosophical visionaries and many, many others, some of which will, kind of be brought into my discussion because pieces of what other people have said resonate very intuitively, very deeply with me. But I wanted to clarify that the essence of my process, though, isn't, say, for instance, an intellectual one of going around and collecting all these interesting things that people say and then just saying, well, look at this. The core is more personal, intuitive experience as the foundation of my own process of deepening my participation and understanding of the world situation, as well as what I'm sharing with you in the course. So, as I was mentioning earlier, a key theme that I brought up last time is the notion of a planetary awakening. And this is a good example in some ways of understanding one of the key ways that intuition works, is that intuition often has its root in our individual personal process. In other words, there's a concept we run into frequently in different philosophies of the notion of the way in which the microcosm, in our case, human nature as an individual and a microcosm, reflects or mirrors in many ways the larger reality, the macrocosm that we're a part of. It's been said things like, if you want to know God, know yourself, or as above, so below. So there's a way in which we can, through understanding deeply our own personal nature, and go deep into that in a spiritual way, very many of the basic elements of the structure of the larger reality that we're part of is reflected in each of us. So for instance, in looking at the notion of planetary initiation, part of how we each will more intuitively experience a resonance and understanding of the nature of a planetary process is in part by how much do we experience some personal sense of what that means. So in order to understand and gain some doorway into that, if a larger reality like a planet is capable of going through evolutionary stages, evolve spiritually, and can in fact go through substantial spiritual transitions like a collective awakening, planetary initiation, our own understanding of what individual initiation means as human beings, for instance, can shed a lot of light on that. One of the interesting things that I've discovered in my own process of intuitive unfoldment is that each of the initiations that a human being goes through, each of the basic stages of enlightenment that unfold, each one of these stages has substages to it, within it, and that those substages mirror the larger initiations. In other words, if there are, let's say, 5 major initiations that a human being goes through in order to attain liberation, in order to attain a kind of complete state of wisdom and love and enlightenment, not perfected in the sense that it can't go on into more mature stages, but some kind of transition. I'm going to suggest that what we call the 5th initiation, or the 5th level of enlightenment, is a profoundly significant turning point for a human being, because it essentially represents completing the curriculum, the basic curriculum that is what the human kingdom is about for us. So each of these different stages of initiation can be understood more and more profoundly in terms of like, well, what is unique, what is particular to that stage, and how do they all, as a unit, how do all 5 of them kind of fit together and represent something, a wholeness? My experience is there hasn't been a whole lot of exploration of this, a whole lot of discussion about it on our planet so far at this time. But this is part of the spiritual understanding that will be becoming a lot more clear in the, I think, centuries ahead. And one of the particularly powerful things to understand is how sometimes, particular individuals will talk about that there are substages, but it's not very clear. It's not very frequently spoken to. What are these subdivisions? And for me, it's a mirroring process. Within each initiation, there are, so for instance, there's a first substage to the first initiation, and a second substage, and a third. And say, for instance, during the second substage, there are elements to that substage that where a person's going through the first initiation hasn't completed yet. It doesn't complete to the fifth substage of the first initiation. But in the second substage, there's a lot that's similar to the second initiation that particularly pertains a lot to our emotional nature, our astral body. It's not uncommon for there to be a kind of opening to more energetic experiences, even psychic experiences, so that even though now it wouldn't be as rich as when one's going through the second initiation cycle, because that's more fundamentally about that. But there's a substage of the first where that is there, that's reflected, that comes out. It's even said, for instance, in Theravada Buddhist teachings, that if you're a very accomplished meditator, and that's your style of going through the initiation, let's say you've become a monk and you're meditating quite a few hours every day, 5, 7, 8 hours a day. So meditation has become a very significant part of your path, and you can get quite good at it even as a developing first degree initiate. Doing a technique like Vipassana in this context can generate a state where, as you go, say through the fourth substage of the first initiation, during your meditations, you can enter into states where you feel like a fourth degree initiate. You're essentially in that substage, and so in that state of consciousness, say during a practice like meditation, you'll feel temporarily like a baby fourth degree initiate, where the essence of that, you'll have very profound equanimity, your heart will feel very spacious, things will feel very integrated and whole, your mindfulness will be very lucid. And then you'll have a moment at the fifth called variously a Kensho or Satori moment in Zen, or a moment of self-realization. In Theravada Buddhism, they call it a path moment, because you pierced through the first initiation cycle and you've entered into the next stage of the path. So it's a path, kind of a path transition moment. And in that moment, there's a flash, a very brief flash of perfect self-realization, where you experience as if you're a liberated master. And then seconds later, you emerge back out of that state, and your unresolved karma reemerges, and you're back into the process of now moving towards the second initiation. And then you recapitulate those cycles again. You go through the second substage, and the third substage, and the fourth substage. And then at the second initiation, when it completes, all of those are like the sub-cycles of that initiation. And then at the fifth substage of the second initiation, another path moment happens, another pure penetration into a state where there's no sensation of being separate, there's no sensation of suffering, there's a moment of pure nirvana, pure self-realization, and then you're formally, in a sense, you might say, a second degree initiate now. You've penetrated through that reality and attained that next level. So a profoundly developed initiate is capable of looking at somebody, a practitioner who's, say, working on the second initiation, and if they have the proper training, they will be able to discern intuitively and say, this person is clearly in the second substage of the second initiation, and it looks like they're very ripe and about to make a transition into the third substage. And based on that trajectory, in 2 years, they'll be passing through the second initiation completion and moving into the next cycle. So the same thing can be done looking at the world situation. We can say, is there some kind of initiatory process going on? And if so, what substage are we in that initiation? And how long do those last? If an individual's can last weeks, months, years, depends on the person, what kind of path they're on, what kind of karma. These substages may be drawn out over decades, or they may be more, kind of collapsed into short periods of time. In rare instances, people can move through them very rapidly in a matter of hours or days. Usually that means they've gone through it already in another incarnation, and their personality and body is merely recapitulating that experience. So with that basic idea in mind, there's a lot of illumination that becomes possible in terms of looking at the world situation. We can gain some clarity, not the least of which is a recognition that when we're going through these sub-stages that are the first, second, third, and fourth, those 4 substages, just like the 4 initiations themselves, first through fourth, there's something distinctly different about those than that 5th moment, that Satori, as they call it, sometimes in Zen. In that moment of transition, it's more of a kind of quantum leap phenomena where a moment of complete immersion in transcendence takes place. And it's as if you enter into a fundamentally different viewpoint of the nature of reality, and everything looks different. Everything is reborn in that light. Whereas in the previous sub-stages moving up to that initiation, it's a bit more linear. There's a kind of gradual unfoldment of understanding, of spiritual qualities. And both of these dimensions are part of spiritual development, the gradual aspect and this, what could be called the sudden aspect, that moment when things just change, this fundamental shift in some way. Those are fairly rare. The full-blown kind of dramatic, more catastrophic awakenings that where this is just a profound reversal or deepening of understanding are actually ultimately somewhat rare in the sense that, well, if we think about it in these terms, if a human being's going to simply go through 5 of them as the process of attaining self-realization, and that usually that's stretched out over lifetimes, that even while we're on the path, there can be lifetimes where none of them take place for the first time. So say, for instance, in a given incarnation, a person might pass through the first initiation and have a very significant shift in their whole orientation to life. They've sort of broken through a veil, and they're now engaged on consciousness, and energy has been released in their nature that's now propelling them on in a new way. They're on the path. In a sense, just prior to the first initiation, you're kind of working up towards it, but you can kind of oscillate in that relationship. But getting through that first initiation really establishes a more fundamental groundedness in the path. And even though it's possible to get a little sidetracked in lifetimes or during that lifetime after that, there's still a much more powerful reality that's been awakened in the soul and in the personality that compels that person on, drives the path. And then it can be a few lifetimes till the next one takes place. These are major, significant transitions. But there's lots of smaller ones too. Like if a person goes through one of the sub-stages, completes a sub-stage of initiation, that can be a very significant period for that person and lead to a significant shift for them. So part of what, by the way, what we're kind of experiencing on the earth right now is a time when this kind of level of richness of understanding the path isn't generally part of the way people experience being on the path. For instance, I can imagine that it's likely that many of you listening to me talk about these ideas of these not only major stages, but the finer substages might think, where am I in this process? Would it be useful to understand? Well, it can definitely be useful to understand, but it's not a type of a dimension of spiritual science that's really been very well developed on our planet. There's a powerful way in which it doesn't really matter how advanced a particular initiate is in their own self-realization. It could be a very great soul, a Shankara, or a Saint Francis, or a Padmasambhava, and however realized such a person may be, the path that they participate and share, and the way that they, for instance, some of these people, of course, have been great guides in the path and so on. But the nature of the wisdom that they share with other people is in part based on their own realization, but in part it's also based on the overall level of development of the world around them. It's similar again to science. Science is a pretty good kind of metaphor or analogy to a lot of things in the spiritual world that's useful to kind of shed some light. And one of the phenomena we see with science is it doesn't matter how great a genius the scientist is, they still have to work within the context of the science of their time. So for instance, if we have someone like an Einstein in the world with that kind of creative genius, but they lived, say, 300 years ago, then Einstein wouldn't have come up with the theory of relativity because the time period couldn't support that. You needed the overall development of science to be advanced enough so that a jump like that could take place. But it doesn't just take place in a vacuum. It's still rooted in the times that scientist exists in. And the exact same thing is true in spiritual traditions. Each initiate in their own intuitive development can stretch past the basic level of development of the world around them and understand all kinds of things that aren't understood by ordinary people that don't have as much intuitive development. But they can't just jump to the most just any understanding. It's still tied to the world situation, the world karma, the collective level. One of the values of joining a lineage is that that's a little microcosm, and you can go deeper into, it's kind of like a little group of specialists. You might say they're esotericists because they have a common language and they're all working in similar ways, and they can sort of support each other and even going farther along from the collective. That's one of the reasons why we have this notion that was, first discussed in various traditions, like Yogananda talked about it, or Blavatsky talked about it. Many others have made reference to it as well, that there's a community around the world of initiates, masters, deep intuitive mystics who, among other things, are essentially researchers, intuitive researchers. That's one of their functions. And because they're kind of behind the scenes and they're very advanced intuitives and they work closely together, cooperatively, they're able to develop a body of spiritual wisdom that's quite a bit more advanced, not only from, of course, relative to ordinary humanity, but even relative to the existing traditions out in the world. But even for those people, even for those beings, they're still conditioned by the general state of the world situation. So if it's true, for instance, that the Earth is in the process of hopefully passing through the first planetary initiation, one of the implications of that is it means fundamental shift in the condition of the world, its karma, its level of enlightenment. And that makes possible a kind of significant new unfoldment of spirituality in the world. The profundity, the richness, the depth to which it becomes clear how the nature of reality, how spiritual evolution takes place. There are just a wide variety of different issues and concerns and areas of understanding that are possible that'll attain much more profound levels of clarification, let's say. I'll just speak in general terms, say over the next 1,000 years. People will look back 5,000 years from now and say, during this period that we're in the midst of now and will go on for some time, there was a fundamental breakthrough. And in that light, a change happened not only in human culture, but even in the spiritual traditions of the world, so that an enormous expansion of spiritual wisdom took place, where it became a lot easier to understand things that were a bit more esoteric, and also that there were new types of insights. An example of which I would say is a clarity about the nature of the spiritual path that'll become much more subtle and multifaceted and profound, so that people will have people's paths will be illuminated with a lot more clarity about things like, where exactly am I on this path? What type of a soul am I? What is my special kind of makeup? And in the context of my specific type, and understanding more precisely where I'm at on the path, what precise kinds of spiritual practices would be optimally ideal for me? It's possible to have enormous clarity about these things, and we just don't have as much of that on this planet yet, because our planet's just not, it's not like there's something wrong with the initiates on the planet, like somehow they're, actually we have a very wonderful richness of spiritual development on this planet, and the masters that are part of the earth are very, very rich, relatively speaking, partially because of the kind of the intense challenge that the earth has been. If you achieve liberation on a planet like ours, it's extraordinarily powerful, because you've gone through a kind of unusually intense training on this planet. Nonetheless, that doesn't make, but the way in which masters, liberated masters, are perfect, you might say, is that they're perfect in the clarity of their realization that they're not separate, that they're interdependent with all of life. There's a fundamental intuitive realization that they've attained that's very clear, very powerful, and very integrated with their nature, so that their whole mind and body are sort of brought up into this realization of a profound sense of interconnectedness. This is what mastery means. There's other ways to talk about it, but that's a very important way to talk about the essence of it. It doesn't mean that that individual has perfect relative knowledge and wisdom. They might have, an understanding of the spiritual path that in some detail is actually inaccurate, or it's not the best way to understand it. It can be improved. So at the relative level, initiates at all levels, even higher masters, their relative wisdom is gradually evolving over the centuries, not only individually, but collectively. But their core self-realization is a different type of wisdom. It's not about the details, it's about the essence. And a mystic now and a mystic 5,000 years ago have both attained the same basic self-realization if they become liberated. What evolves and what changes is more the details. What kind of an intuitive science are you operating out of? How much clarity do you have about the best ways to pursue different spiritual practices, ways to describe that self-realization? It's one thing to intuitively have a pure mystical realization of something. It's another thing to form a philosophy about it and to try to talk about it. immediately upon doing that, imperfection starts to come in, and their strengths and weaknesses to different versions of doing that. And that level is always evolving. There's infinite potential to improve and expand on all of that. Yes, there's a question here about substages of, say, during the Renaissance or ancient Greece. Real quickly, I mean, that's a wonderful topic and an interesting question. My current understanding is that in ancient Greece was prior to the Earth entering into any of the substages of the planetary initiation. That's sort of pre. Doesn't mean that there weren't other kinds of cycles. You can also apply this intuitive perspective of cycles in other ways to the planet as a whole, the emergence of different kingdoms, substages in the human kingdom over tens of thousands of years. So there are ways of looking at things like, well, what happened in ancient Greece? Why did we have this remarkable time period where in Greece we had Plato and Pythagoras and Aristotle, and simultaneously around the same time period in China we had Lao Tse arising and the Buddha in India. This is a very profound and remarkable time period within just a century or two. What was that all about? What was happening in the planet that this remarkable period took place? And there are ways to understand that in these larger contexts, or the Renaissance more recently. But the specific thing that we're talking about right now, which is the notion of a planetary initiation, that's relatively more recent. For me, it doesn't extend back thousands of years. It's more something that's been emerging recently and will go on for some time before the fundamental shift takes place. So in one sense, you could say we're in the cycle. One way to talk about an initiation is, instead of focusing on that specific moment of transition, we can talk about being kind of within the archetype of that initiation, like that there's a certain underlying theme and phase that we're in that colors that whole period of time. And that's that in this context, that would be all the 4 or 5 substages, the 4 first substages, and then the basic, core transition moment. On a planetary level, it feels to me like we're, in that way of understanding things, we are in fact in the cycle of the first initiation. It's not entirely clear. There's different perspectives about this, but from just a kind of basic, intuitive, human level point of view, it's not entirely clear how that will work out. It's not uncommon for people to work through a few substages of an initiation like the first, and then just kind of plateau there for that rest of that incarnation, or maybe even fall back temporarily, and then a couple lifetimes later they do it again, and that time they pass through the first initiation. Viewed from a more cosmic perspective, it's not, from a relative point of view, it's not clear what will happen for the Earth. Will we get through this initiation? It's a very powerful crisis. There's another piece, by the way, that is important to understand. And that is what specific karma is the Earth working through? What is our karmic situation in the world today, and what kind of ancient karmas are necessary to work through in order to make it through this initiation. So two of the parts of the crisis are the specific karma that we're working through and the sub-stages that we're in right now. One of the sub-stages of each initiation, the fourth, mirrors the fourth initiation. Those of you who are familiar with certain Western esoteric teachings will recognize that some people have drawn a parallel between these several sub-stages and the stages in Christ's life. Often it's the birth, the baptism, the transfiguration, the crucifixion, and the ascension, or that's kind of interpreted the fifth stage variously by different people. But a common identification for the fourth initiation, kind of drawing a parallel from Christ's life as a kind of archetypal story of a reflection of those five stages, is the fourth initiation. So the fourth subplane, the fourth sub-stage of any initiation is a kind of mini crucifixion, a mini death rebirth moment. It's my feeling that that's very much the sub-stage that we're into now around the first planetary initiation. There's a kind of a further complexity of all of this that has to do with that. Even though there are these discrete stages, there can be a kind of oscillation in the stages, a kind of developing sometimes more than one at the same time. So we won't get too precise right now about talking about exactly where we are, because I think it's kind of complicated, partially for reasons that we haven't talked about yet. So it would be difficult to kind of launch into more detail about that right now. But part of what is involved in every cycle of initiation is going through a shift. Very powerful analogy. I may have shared this before in a recent webinar. It's useful to get a sense of these initiations, is that if we look at the what's called in modern science the states of matter, about what in traditional spiritual systems is often just called the elements, solid, liquid, gas, for instance, are the first three, often just referred to as earth, water, and air. It's interesting to note in looking at the normal physical version of these states that as you increase the heat, let's say of water, let's say you take some water out of your tap in the kitchen and you put it on the stove to heat it up to boiling. It comes out of the tap at a particular temperature, and then you put heat under it, and a minute or two later, it's getting warmer, but it's not boiling yet. So it actually has changed. The vibrations of the molecules of the water are vibrating more than they were a minute or two ago. But they haven't gone through that state change where they're suddenly a gas. They've turned into vapor. So this will go on for a while, several minutes of the vibrations raising, until suddenly the boiling point is reached and a transition starts to happen. Let's imagine that you are like the consciousness inside of the water. You have like water consciousness, and you experience yourself as being in a state of being a liquid. You're flowing around. So your sense of what it means to be H2O, water, is liquid. That's your understanding of that reality. And you feel a change is happening, your vibrations are increasing, but you're still liquid, so no problem there. Eventually you might get to a point though where you start to enter that transition. One of the reasons that we have this metaphor in spiritual context of death and rebirth is because there are transition moments where something basic about the state that we're in goes through a radical change. And it's difficult to see the continuity between the before and the after, because even though we know on some level water, or H2O, is still the same chemical compound, whether it's ice or liquid or steam, the state looks different. So if you're the part that's kind of identified with thinking, you're not thinking I'm water, you're thinking I'm a fluid, then when you get to the boiling point and you're starting to experience a sensation that something's changing, the experience of being a liquid seems to be falling away and I'm turning into something else. You don't have any framework to understand what that is. All you're experiencing is what I was before is dying. It's destabilizing. I can't relate to it anymore. It's falling apart. And I don't know what I'm becoming. I have no familiarity with that. If you could tune into the level of your nature that knows that you're this chemical compound we call water, or H2O, no matter which state you're in, then there wouldn't be as much of a sensation of dying and being reborn. But part of our nature is to identify with that level of reality too. And so that transition is like any other transition. So that's part of the way to understand why is there such a specific thing about these substages? They really are like that transition, where the spiritual growth that preceded that transition point was more like heating up a liquid. Vibrations are changing, and there is some kind of evolution going on there. But then you reach this critical turning point where you're about to turn into gas, and that's a whole different ballgame. And usually, especially in the earlier initiations, there tends to be a more distinct sensation of disorientation, confusion, fear even, and an inability to really comprehend what's happening. But suddenly there's a quantum leap moment where a transition is made, and then it all makes sense. You're in the new point of view, and then your life can be sort of reordered around a new type of identity, a new sort of organizing vision of the nature of reality, the nature of yourself, the nature of the world around you. So in many ways, humanity and the planet as a whole is pushing into these ranges now in the first initiation, where there's a lot of confusion arising. There's a lot of disorientation. And part of what happens is this thing that we call, it's like we have a dual nature, in the same way that water has a dual nature, where at one level it's the same element, there's actually a compound, H2O, whether it's solid, liquid, or gas. So at one level, it's the same in any of those states, but another part of its nature is it takes different forms depending on its level of energy. So human nature is the same way. And that aspect of whether it's a solid, liquid, or gas, that is like there's some essential principle that's expressing through that substance that we could call like its solid nature, or its liquid nature, or its gas nature. And that is like a point of view. We all have experiences in life sometimes where something has happened, it's confusing, and then suddenly we get a piece of information that we didn't have before, and now all of a sudden the situation makes sense. Everything's clarified. It's as if we're like looking through the point of view of this new piece of information. It's like a vantage point that gives a proper context to the situation, where a bunch of confusing, it's like you watch a mystery movie. And a classic way to kind of create the context, the energy of the story in the movie is you introduce these different pieces of the puzzle. And often, in clever storytelling, you even kind of try to do it sometimes in a way that misdirects the audience so they think it's kind of moving towards one clarification, one story, one perspective in which it will all make sense. But in fact, it's something else. But until you get to that perspective, it just won't hang together. Life is like that for a human being. Each of us has deep down in our nature, and even to some extent, depending on the person, in our conscious nature, there's some kind of guiding, soulful principle that is informing our lives, that makes life make sense, that makes it feel meaningful, that kind of organizes it, holds things together. Sometimes on a spiritual path, we call that our purpose in life. That our purpose informs, why do we get out of bed in the morning? What makes sense about the world? Why do we do the behaviors that we do? Spiritual path is like that. If we have some underlying story, like I'm seeking greater love and wisdom, and that becomes the story, and our life starts to become illuminated by looking at everything that's happening in the context of that. Oh, I'm going through a lot of pain right now. Well, that's a normal part of the story of developing love and wisdom. As you embrace these principles and cultivate them, old habits and energies and karma will come up, and it needs to be healed. And that whole story only makes sense in the light of this principle that I'm cultivating love and wisdom. That's the organizing principle behind the whole story. When we go through an initiation, that principle changes. It dies, and a new one is born. We awaken to a new guiding understanding of life deep in our souls. But in order to get to that new understanding, the old one has to die. We have to start to feel that something's incomplete about the previous point of view. Things weren't completely integrated or holding together. Maybe I used to think they were, but now I'm starting to sense, even in ways I don't understand, something's not as whole as it could be, as complete, as universal. So whether we're aware of the details of how that's happening or not, that's part of what each of these basic stages of initiation means, is it's a basic death and rebirth in terms of some core reality that we're connected to as spiritual beings, even in our higher selves, as we go through these initiations. So imagine on a planetary level, if the planet as a whole and within the human kingdom, there's a shift going on in the life force and the guiding vision and the basic sense of reality collectively on a planetary scale. It's profoundly disruptive. It's very disorganizing. One of the ways we see it in the world today is hundreds of millions of people have lost touch with a sense that spirituality makes sense. The old archetypal form of spirituality that most people were familiar with was what we sometimes call organized religion. And it generally didn't have a very profound sense of personal mysticism associated with it. People didn't relate to it as a path to individual self-realization, individual liberation, individual enlightenment, any of these principles. At best, and it communicated some kind of positive values, like trying to just be a good person, to be kind, to not be violent, to not be dishonest, and so on. So that was part of the old archetype, the old organizing vision of what religion meant. And at the heart of all ancient cultures is generally some kind of version of this, whether Native American to the ancient Romans and Greeks to Chinese and Australian Aborigines. Every culture had at its heart a religious or spiritual vision that was the glue that held their culture together. It was the underlying unitive life force inspiration for how to be a human being. What does it mean to be a human being? How should we live? But the basic version of that, even though there's some elements of organized religion that are perfectly valuable, the basic spirit of its understanding of reality, its understanding of us as human beings and the world around us, where did it all come from, how should we live? There's something about the version of that that's existed for humanity for thousands of years in the outer forms of religion that hundreds of millions of people in the world today just aren't connecting to anymore. It's not working for them. One of the reasons is it wasn't based adequately on a more rational understanding of life. It wasn't as psychologically sophisticated enough. It wasn't scientifically sophisticated enough. Oftentimes people who are attached to immature version, we find this in the United States a lot with fundamentalism, where when science and their philosophy collide, they're more inclined to just say, well, science is wrong. The earth isn't billions of years old, it's thousands of years old. And, there's no way in which, the whole creationism versus evolution issue and so on. Some of these are complex issues, but fundamentalism isn't really offering an answer for those questions that is appealing to a huge number of people. So around the world, there's just millions of people that are confused and disinterested in all of that, but they're in transition. They haven't necessarily embraced an alternative. So that weakens their connection to a deep sense of spiritual purpose in life, which it makes difficult for civilization to be based on that kind of thing. We need a powerful unitive spirit at the soul of the human kingdom to hold it together and to inspire human life and human activity. And right now, that is in a planetary crisis where the old ways are dying, and on a large scale, the new way hasn't been born yet. It's emerging, though, and many millions of people are embracing new spiritualities. They're either kind of returning to the mystical aspects of the existing traditions, or they're participating in some kind of a more kind of new emergent spirit that's kind of maybe drawing pieces from different places and fashioning a new spirit. But that transition hasn't completed yet. We have a fair amount of development to go before a deep passing away of the older, less mature aspects of spirituality and religion on the planet, and the cultural elements that go along with that and so on. All of that's passing. So in that confusion, our civilization is in disruption. That's one of the key elements of the pain and confusion and disruption that we're experiencing in the world today is a major planetary-wide death and rebirth of spirituality happening, where we're shifting archetypes from a basic approach that was behind the majority of the outer world religions and moving into the essence behind them, into a much deeper intuitive understanding of the essence of spirituality. That's a profound awakening, but it's also a very difficult one, especially at the first initiation, because at the first initiation, the soul has little experience with these shifts. And so, let's say if you're a third degree initiate and you're going through the third initiation, and you have even in that life, you might have kind of recapitulated the earlier stages. Some part of you now is getting wiser and saying, oh, I've gone through this before. I know that there is a deeper reality that is beyond these changes that I'm going through. And the more I open to that, the less the death rebirth level is so consuming and confusing. And I can hold a larger context in spite of the challenges of these transitions. The first initiation, the individual doesn't have that kind of wisdom yet. There is less contact both on an individual level. When the individual goes through that initiation, that's part of the value of a spiritual community or a spiritual path, and teachings and teachers. They help to hold that context, and they can shed light for the individual on what they're going through. On a planetary level, we don't have that. We don't have an open relationship with civilizations beyond the Earth that have been through this already, and that humanity is consciously in relationship to. These beings exist, and they are helping to midwife this rebirth for our planet. But humanity is, for the most part, not aware of them. So we can't consciously, as a human kingdom, benefit from other beings that have been through, that are farther along in this process and can shed light. So our planet, even the planetary entity itself, I'm not talking about the great masters that are associated with the planet, I'm talking about the sum total of life and consciousness of the planetary, I call it the planetary being or the planetary entity. This being is confused and struggling in this transition. And there's further complications added on top of that as well that we'll come to shortly. But you can see that, to the extent as we move more and more into this death rebirth dimensions of planetary awakening, this is a key part of what's important to understand about why it's so difficult. And a lot of the symptoms that we see around us in the world today, what they stem from is this basic process of death and rebirth. So I noticed that we've gotten along in time now, so why don't we go ahead and take a break now, and then we'll come back and we'll do a meditation. So why don't we take 10 minutes now. Okay, let's have a meditation. Let's take a moment to settle in now. Be aware of your physical body. Relax more. Be aware of your breathing. And your body as a whole. Feel yourself becoming more present. More aware. More at peace. just being content in being. Particularly using awareness of your body as your anchor, your foundation. Just feel yourself becoming more present, more accepting, more aware, more at peace. Any thoughts that pass by, any emotions that might be lingering around, awareness of things in your life that may be present. Just let it all be there. Just in this moment, just accepting everything, being at peace. And feel a spirit of love and goodwill towards your personality, towards your body and emotions and mind. Just accepting everything that's there. And wishing goodwill, positive feelings towards your personality. Turn your attention to the surface that you're resting on. Feeling a sense of physical groundedness in the world, connection to the physical plane. And sense a way in which you're also energetically connected to the world. You're part of the grid of energy, of life force flowing in the world. You're both nourished by this energy that flows, and you contribute to it. Sense the way in which the peace that you feel, the presence of your consciousness and your love contributes to this web of energy in the world as a whole. As your own state of presence continues to deepen and become more peaceful and aware, warm and loving, accepting and content. Sense how you're anchoring a quality that is the future of our world. You become a bridge. Feel how in a humble and simple and grounded way, you're holding the energy of where humanity and the earth is being reborn into. Each of us deepening into this state also in our own little way helps midwife the collective rebirth. In your inner vision, see the earth as a whole. and see it surrounded and infused with white light. Feel this light filled with peace and love, wisdom, and healing energy. All the colors of the rainbow in white light, all the qualities, wisdom. As you see the earth bathed in white light, wish that peace grow stronger and stronger in the earth and in humanity. That wisdom awakens more and more. That a spirit of interconnectedness grows. Your attention now more to your physical body again. Continue to feel your sense of connection to the light in the world. Becoming more aware of the room around you, the surface that you're in contact with, physical body. And when ready, open your eyes. At this point, I'm going to see if there's any questions that anyone has. Unmute now. Make an opportunity to see if okay. So there's a question about how do we know when we're disoriented whether we're falling back or it's just part of the process of transformation. It's in the moment, in experiences like that, it's often hard to tell the difference. One of the ways to, especially because a basic element of the spiritual path is that, among other things, we're constantly transforming and healing, purifying old energies, old karma, old thoughts and emotions. It can be confusing at times to understand like exactly what's going on, and because it's normal for these energies to arise in a way that can feel confusing, painful, disorienting, even to be to states where emotionally we feel like we lost ground sometimes, like we don't feel as whole as we might have a year before. We might go through periods where there's less vitality in our bodies. We feel more tired or more lacking a sense of inspiration, or various challenges like this. And many times these are normal parts of the path, but it's tempting to think, something wrong? Am I not practicing enough, or am I practicing in the wrong way, or what's happening? A basic way to have a sense of clarity about that is that if we are engaged in some kind of a spiritual practice, let's say it's as simple as working with spiritual presence in our day-to-day lives. Let's say we're focusing on just being more mindful, being more accepting in our day-to-day lives, being more content and patient and other qualities like that. If we feel that essentially we're still able to make an effort to deepen these qualities on a day-to-day basis, or if we're engaged in an internal practice like meditation where we feel we can sustain that practice. There's sometimes when people run into kind of more difficult patches or even what people, St. John called dark night of the soul type phases. There's a phrase in the Buddhist tradition, the rolling up the mat phase, where it's making reference to the notion of using a mat to meditate on, and even advanced practitioners can sometimes go through dark night of the soul, challenging death rebirth phases that are disorienting and difficult enough to cause a person to feel like they want to roll up their mat and give up on their practice. Generally, though, it's advisable that if we can just sustain, even through part of the challenge of spiritual practices, to sustain through difficult times, to just practice, have faith, keep moving forward, in spite of how we feel. How we feel on a day-to-day basis isn't necessarily a guide to how we're doing on the path. The things that we have to get accustomed to is that there are ups and downs, and it's certainly difficult and challenging phases in the path. We may even go on for years in a certain sub-phase where we feel like a sort of steady progress is being made. We're getting more loving, more kind, more patient, and then suddenly or gradually we move into another period where we don't feel as good. We don't even feel like we can be our better self as well as we could a year or a few years ago. This isn't necessarily a sign that there's a problem. There are rhythms to the transformation and purification of our personality. And so part of wisdom is gaining some perspective where we have enough equanimity towards these ups and downs, where we have faith, we keep going, we understand that this is a natural part of the process. And we persist in spite of these difficult periods, some of which can sometimes last for very long periods of time. We hear, for instance, of instances where people have very powerful phases of Kundalini awakening that can lead to extremely disruptive phenomena, even to the point where the person might feel like they're very strained in their day-to-day functioning. And sometimes these things can be avoided and sometimes they can't for any particular individual. But these periods become particularly challenging to kind of keep going and have faith. It's advisable to, if it's within our control, to moderate these things and not engage in such rigorous spiritual practice or certain kinds of practices that can lead to such a fiery ordeal in life. Sometimes, especially for more advanced souls, when there's a lot of power behind their spiritual awakening, a person will go through a fast phase, that fast in the sense that there's a lot of transformation happening quickly. And it might even go on for years, even decades, but it's actually a very rapid burning off of karma, you might say, very intense transformation process. And there's kind of no stopping it. There are souls for whom that's just sort of the what's up for that incarnation, and there's a great deal of progress being made, but it's very difficult. But generally, for your average practitioner, it's best to be a little bit more moderate and balanced about things and be willing to tolerate and open to the reality that there's going to be difficulty at times. Sadness and depression and discomfort and even anger and all different kinds of emotions, different kinds of physical sensations can arise. This is a normal part of the path. So spiritual Chinese Qigong, Taoist Buddhist Qigong adept that I met some decades ago. And he often called these phenomena Qigong reactions, meaning like as you're practicing Qigong and you're awakening energies, what Hindus would call Kundalini, but what in other contexts would simply be called the awakening of wisdom or the cultivation of virtue. different ways of looking at it. They're all the same thing. Kundalini isn't some magical separate energy that's disconnected from other parts of your nature. It's an energetic expression of virtue and of wisdom. So if you awaken wisdom, you're awakening Kundalini. If you're awakening Kundalini, you're awakening wisdom. They're not separate. But we can experience in our ordinary human nature, we can experience them within their different facets. So if a person is doing a practice like Vipassana and they're emphasizing the cultivation of insight, that doesn't mean they won't go through Kundalini type phenomena that this master Yan Shin called Qigong reactions, or they call it by various names in the Hindu tradition, but reactions to Kundalini awakening, or you'll find, descriptions in other contexts. This has become prevalent enough in the West that even in the some of the textbooks and classifications in psychology, they're now offering a new category called Qigong something, Qigong syndrome, I think. It's in the DSM latest, what is it, the fourth or fifth, has Qigong reactions as one of the categories where clinicians are starting to sort of acknowledge that some people are going through this weird type of phenomena that's a reaction to doing certain kinds of spiritual practices, not just Qigong. So it's important to recognize these things and understand that this is an integral part of the path. And there's a couple of main ways that times can get more difficult, either from the angle of it being sort of a death rebirth cycle and being confusing, and or the natural healing and energetic purification processes that are inherent in the spiritual path. And most people go through the path in such a way as that there's a greater degree of balance. And so there's sort of ups and downs, and there's difficult mixed in with positive, but it's kind of more moderate at any given point. But we all need to be aware that it can be more intense. Many people do experience periods where it's more challenging or more confusing. And try to have faith that this is a natural part of the process. And if we continue to feel like our equanimity particularly is deepening, it can be challenging, by the way, if we measure our spiritual progress. We all have a tendency to kind of hoping, we're making progress on the path. So we look for ways to measure that, like, am I getting more peaceful? Am I becoming more loving? The challenge with some of these ways of looking at our processes, it's not always linear, and we can be making spiritual progress, but feel on a more emotional or physical level, feel less peaceful than we did a year ago. And so we have to be careful not to gauge on a more short-term basis how we're doing, because we're more likely to become discouraged when we do that. In a sense, it's the same thing with the world situation. There's ways in which the world situation looks like it's going in a negative direction right now. Many people feel that way. But again, in my view, this is a collective version of the same thing, of these, not only the ups and downs on the path and the challenges of purification and healing, but also in the nature of certain core elements of transformation, like the death rebirth process in spiritual awakening. In the end, it's often not possible ourselves to know exactly what's going on. That's one of the reasons it can be useful to have a lineage or a spiritual teacher that we're connected to. If we're going through particularly hard times, very often people will kind of reach out to somebody and say, what do you think is happening, to get some additional perspective. So if we're not able to find a place within ourselves at that moment that has enough, that has able to have sort of an intuitive clarity that rises above the pain and kind of stays connected to a sense that this is working. It's very understandable that frequently that's not possible when things are rough. then it can be useful to have some kind of additional context. Unfortunately, sometimes people turn to psychologists or even physicians or a local spiritual counselor, like a priest or a minister. And sometimes people of these sorts can be helpful and can have some perspective, but very often if there's a deep spiritual dimension to what's happening, they will often misunderstand the nature of it. So it's important to be careful what kind of source we turn to in trying to understand our spiritual process and what we're going through. Another question that popped up. You're welcome. So Britta had a question. Let me turn the microphones on.
Okay. I have a question that is sort of what the influence we are under. Like I've been thinking about lately, is there more than one hierarchy? We have sort of been taught that there is one hierarchy, the seven rays, the masters on each ray, and Christ is the leader of the hierarchy. But is that only from the West? Is there a lot of hierarchies around Earth? Because a lot of things would make so much sense if there was one hierarchy for Africa, one hierarchy for China, and so on. Mm-hmm. And who would be the leader of all of those hierarchies? Because that would maybe give a lot of answers to what is going on. Maybe we have missed important reasons or explanations to why the situation is as it is in humanity. So is there a lot of hierarchies, and who's the leader of all of them, if so?
Very good question. Yes, my view is that there is a number of hierarchies, not maybe a lot, but on the earth, there is, in a sense, well, one way to look at it is from the point of view of lineages. Let's say, we get involved with a Sufi teacher, and we become, in some sense, part of that lineage. On the most immediate level, that specific teacher is a part of our connection to a style of spirituality, a perspective. We can maybe get initiated, in a sense, into that point of view and that way of practicing. And we have a personal connection to that teacher. Now, that teacher might be one of many teachers within a certain subdivision. Like in Sufism, there's several major schools of Sufi thought. So in a sense, we're kind of connecting to one, but there is actually a bunch of teachers in that school, and then there's several different schools. So in one sense, if we trace that lineage deeper, it could go all the way back to a central figure. Like in one sense, Muhammad and Sufism is connected to Islam. But it might be a particular, first a subdivision, so it's connected to a main kind of a person who's the head of that lineage, spiritually speaking. Like in Tibetan Buddhism, a central figure is usually seen as Padmasambhava. But in Buddhism, there's many different sublineages. A few major schools like Mahayana Buddhism, Theravada Buddhism, Vajrayana Buddhism. Just to be a little simple about it, there's more complexity than that. But within them, there's lots of subdivision. Like the Gelugpa order sees itself as part of the Tibetan Buddhism, but it's kind of a different emphasis than, say, one of the other schools in the Mappa tradition. So at a certain point, though, we trace these lineages back to some very major figures like Jesus or Lao Tse or the Buddha. And now we're talking about something that's very, much more universal. On a planetary scale, you could say, well, there's probably some deep way in which in Africa there's a kind of underlying impulse or spiritual tradition that is the unified essence or soul of the African traditions, not maybe including the far northern ones where they kind of merge into the Middle Eastern traditions, but the kind of main body of Africa. Same with the Native American traditions or the Chinese traditions or the kind of Indian, Tibetan traditions and so on. So my view is that once you start to get very deep, you get into these core unifications beyond all the different dimensions of Christianity. There's one Christianity. So at that level, there's maybe only several major planetary traditions. And from that point of view, a lot of them are centered around a particular tradition. For instance, the so-called Trans-Himalayan tradition that is, I'm going to turn the sound off here just for a minute. This is, you know, a very, you know, important and interesting topic. I'm going to try to treat it relatively briefly now because I would actually like to offer, if folks are interested, a much more in-depth exploration of this theme that would be more like a whole webinar in itself, because it is so rich and multifaceted, and it actually illuminates a lot of different spiritual questions that people have and a general sense of our participation in planetary life. And it could include a broader discussion of archangelic orders and other forms of life that exist, you know, on the physical and cellular dimensions of the planet. How does all that fit together under one system? But the short version of this question right now is that, to my mind, there is one fundamental planetary lineage. And I often just call it the Shambhala lineage or the planetary lineage. It does not have to my understanding so far, it does not have a very overt manifestation in the physical world of our planet at this time. In fact, that's one of the implications of the first planetary initiation, is that would awaken an energy in the world that would, for the first time, make it possible for the Shambhala lineage to manifest directly as the core lineage. Right now, instead, it's manifest as several major planetary lineages, none of which alone is completely comprehensive. So, for instance, the Trans-Himalayan lineage, which is the term that's used by, you know, Blavatsky and her teachers were the first to introduce that term in the context of a sort of emerging Western esoteric teaching. And essentially what the Trans-Himalayan lineage is it's an Eastern integral tradition that is based in the Shambhala lineage, but is anchored in the Himalayan, Trans-Himalayan range. It was initiated a very long time ago in the prehistory of you know, the human kingdom, so it's many tens of thousands of years ago, and is one of several major planetary lineages. It does not include, say, for instance, the Native American traditions. Right? They don't come underneath that lineage. It does not include the far Asian lineages like Taoism. Those are closely associated because they're geographically so close, but that's a second subdivision. I mentioned earlier Yan Xin, the Chinese adept that I met several decades ago. He's an initiate of that Chinese tradition. They have their headquarters in the mountains of China. There are great planetary bodhisattvas that are part of that tradition, and they're a different set than the ones that people like Blavatsky and other theosophists and other Western esotericists have talked about. They're even different than, say, Sri Guru Babaji that Yogananda talks about, that's a separate, but they talk about each other. You can find, for instance, in the Mahatma letters, there's a big book called the Mahatma letters where mostly Kudhumi, but a little bit Maurya were sending letters to primarily Sinet, trying to essentially trying to interest him in the Dharma and some other things. And at one point, Kudhumi passes over the bulk of the writing of the letters to Maurya, saying, I'm going off on a 3-month journey to the Chinese group to spend some time with them. And while I'm away, I won't be able to maintain the correspondence. So Maurya is going to do that while I'm away, and then I'll pick it up when I get back. So there's this separate group. They're both anchored in the Shambhala universal planetary lineage, but there's separate subdivisions. So the Trans-Himalayan lineage, its ancient roots are in the Sanatana Dharma or the ancient Hindu tradition, but its more modern sub-leaning is connected particularly to Buddhism. So that group looks to Buddha as a primary source of inspiration and to Maitreya as another primary source of inspiration. Their influence is also throughout India. So there's Hindus, there's Sikhs, there's Jains, and Buddhists in Asia that are part of that group. And their influence extends throughout the Middle East and incorporates the ancient Egyptian traditions and Judaism, Christianity, Islam, the Greek traditions, all the way up to Druids, and all of that comes underneath this one subdivision, the so-called Trans-Himalayan. It's the sort of central lineage during this cycle for those type of people. It doesn't include the core African traditions, Australian Aborigines, various forms of Native American traditions, or the far Asian traditions like Taoism or Shintoism and things like that. They come under different subdivisions. But many describe that as probably the most powerful and central lineage at the time. And they're particularly deeply connected right now to another aspect that we'll talk about later of what's happening in the world today, where they're, in a sense, emanating a section of their own expression to create a new manifestation of the Dharma in the world. Its focal point is in the United States, but it's emerging all around the world, especially in Western countries, in Europe and Australia, New Zealand, United States, North America, Canada as well, and so on. And that will eventually become yet a new subdivision over the centuries ahead, just like there's the Chinese one and the Trans-Himalayan one and so on. So there's a lot more that could be said about all of that, but that's sort of a quick response. There's a very strong connection between the Middle Eastern traditions and this Trans-Himalayan group. They're basically ultimately the same group. That's a big conversation too, though, like exactly how that works. Why is there that connection? But notice it's interesting, many people who are familiar with teachings like Alice Bailey's and Leadbeater and even the early Blavatsky teachings, that there's quite a few of these masters around the world, but amongst the 7 key masters that are often talked about, it's interesting to note that the home base, the Ma Chohan, who was the physically incarnate head of that lineage, lived in Tibet, outside of Shigatse, and that was a kind of home base. Like when Blavatsky went to visit the masters there, other people from the Middle East, like Hilarion, she saw visiting this sort of central stronghold home base of the lineage. But 5 of those masters, the Venetians, Serapis, Hilarion, etc., they were all born around the Middle Eastern Europe. So this is not, people often get confused. They think, oh, Blavatsky, it's kind of an Eastern-inspired esotericism, and it's more about Eastern spirituality. It's actually both. It's a very integral planetary tradition that has ancient roots in both the Middle Eastern area and the Indian and Himalayan region. So that's perhaps enough about that at the moment, because that's a big topic. We could go into that more later, as I said.
So Christ should be the leader of all the hierarchies. Christ is from Shambhala, he's the leader? Or different?
Part of the reason I'm not jumping quite into that question yet is that there's some a need to discuss, like, what is the Christ? Who is the Christ exactly? What is Jesus? What is the Christ? What is Maitreya? There's different points of view about that. That's a whole topic. For me, without going too much into the details, I would say there's a being that I would call the planetary Logos, the planetary Christ, the planetary Buddha. It's not the Buddha like Gautama Buddha, or it's not Jesus. But it is a Christ being, or an enlightened Buddha being, or a Logos. That's the head of the planetary hierarchy. And then each of these subdivisions has a head over it, under that being. And so that's kind of the basic structure of the hierarchy, is there's a primordial being that is the one Christ, Buddha, Logos of the planet, and then a number of beings that represent different dimensions of that. You could say like along the rays. And so the Buddha is for Buddhism, the Christ for Christianity, Taoism, and so on. And then around each of those big integral traditions have developed. So if you're studying just ordinary Christianity or ordinary Buddhism, it's kind of contained to that tradition. But at the deeper levels of the planetary consciousness, the masters who specialize in, say, Hinduism or Buddhism or Taoism or Christianity have incorporated a great deal of other dimensions of the planet's spirituality into that tradition. So if you go to, say, the Trans-Himalayan tradition, you see these great masters of Hinduism and Buddhism. They're profoundly integrated with Christianity, with Taoism, with Hinduism, all this stuff. But there's still a subtle leaning in each one. And that's why we say, well, none of them exactly is completely expressing the one planetary lineage yet. That hasn't been born on the physical plane yet. That's another implication of the changes that are happening. Is I expect we're already seeing a little bit of the evidence of that starting to happen, but it's still hundreds of years ahead, and it won't be in a great deal of maturity probably for a couple thousand years or more to come. So I think I saw, you're welcome, another question. Looks like maybe those were mostly comments. Any other questions before we wind up for today? Oh, let me unmute again. Okay. Looks like we're all good then. Okay. Okay, so it seemed like something, just the notion of a deeper understanding of, and by the way, that particular group, these groups that we're talking about, these so-called hierarchies, are particularly those types of beings that generally become enlightened through the human kingdom and are geared towards working very often with the human kingdom. There are other facets of the planetary hierarchy that are not only reflecting working different parts of humanity, but also different parts of the planet as well. So a fuller discussion of the so-called spiritual hierarchies of the planet, which would include archangelic orders and other forms of life that aren't limited to a focus on the human kingdom as well. And so is that perhaps a theme that people would like a more in-depth exploration of? A webinar at some point is the nature of these different kinds of hierarchies and what we know about their work in the world right now. Seems like there's some interest in that, so we'll come back and talk about that in the future then, about that possibility. Okay, well, we'll wind up now. Thank you all for coming. Look forward to seeing you next week.